The United States military has made huge progress in changing the culture of mental health and trying to erase that stigma that surrounds it. Today we have Dr. Samantha Dutton, the program director for University of Phoenix College of Humanities and Sciences, and Dr. Barbara Van Dalen, the president and founder of Give an Hour, with us today. So the University of Phoenix did a new survey and found some pretty alarming statistics. Can you tell us about that?
Absolutely. The University of Phoenix did a survey, and there we found that 70% of active duty members had sought counseling, whereas 32% had not, veterans did not seek counseling. And what that shows me is that the stigma and the myths surrounding mental health is really starting to break down thanks to the leadership and the ability of the military to push forward the conversation of mental health and making it a normal part of a conversation.
And when we're talking about erasing that stigma, what actually needs to be done, do you think, in order to go about doing that?
Thank you, Alex. That's a very important question, because mental health is not a military or veteran issue. It is an issue that we should all be paying attention to. We have mental health just like we have physical health. And we need to start talking more comfortably, more honestly, more openly about mental health challenges, recovery, treatment, resources. If we do that as a broader culture, then those who are in need, whether it's in the military or not, will be much better likely to be able to seek and receive services.
And how can we, or family members, friends of these active duty military members or vets, how can they help them to seek help? Because that can be tough sometimes.
It can be really tough. But also in that survey, 58% of veterans who spoke to other veterans were more likely to seek the counseling. So opening that conversation is so important, and to get the conversation going, organizations such as Give an Hour with Barbara here is very important for that, to get the conversation happening.
And to get that conversation happening, a lot of times you have to have the resources, the education. So where can our viewers find more information?
People can learn the 5 signs of emotional suffering on our website, changedirection.org. It's a public health initiative that was initiated so everyone understands when someone is suffering, and what we need to do, what we all need to do, is when we see these 5 signs, reach out, connect, offer to be of help.
Wow, thanks so much, you guys, for bringing us that information.
Thank you so much.
Thanks to the University of Phoenix College of Health Professions for sponsoring that segment.